the slow pollution of the once biggest and best music app in the world, Spotify. I mean, I do understand it from a business perspective. You have a certain set of users already, and now you want to do something new, like podcasts, like introducing audio into, not introducing audio, but introducing speaking audio. Audio where people speak compared to audio where people just make noises and sing and also play instruments, which is called music. So now, the problem, I think, is this. It's basically my experience. The problem is maybe not something bigger, but it's just my experience. I want to have, just as plainly as possible stated, I want to have a music app. And here's the reason why. Because, as many other people also, I guess, I struggle with keeping music, with keeping audio, with keeping basically entertainment from things I want to learn. If you take YouTube, for example, then YouTube drives you toward just watching more and more and more and more and more and more. TikTok, even more. And the problem is that this slowly degrades your life quality. For every given unit of things you watch on the internet that you just consume and you can't remember in 2 days, you could potentially do something useful that has a leverage effect on your later life. If you don't do this, then basically you don't actually get to keep a certain skill level in any given category. But what actually happens, I think, is much rather plotted over our life. You cannot really keep a current skill level. If this is a current skill level, it either has to constantly go up or go down. So what we are actually looking at is the derivative. Either your derivative, so basically your direction in terms of a specific skill, for example, is either going up or down. But it is never static because it is basically infinitely small, this thing here, which is then called derivative. So now back to Spotify. What does this mean now? If Spotify slowly wants to turn itself into Audible, combined with Spotify, combined with potentially also YouTube, which it currently is doing through the introduction of video podcasts, which is very convenient for video podcasters and just for podcasters in general, because now they have a platform they can actually deliver to. And with Anchor, which is Spotify's hosting service, what they also have is now basically are all in one-stop shop. I don't know, I can't remember the word. It is called a one-stop shop for podcasters. But now the problem is, previously, at least users like me, which I just assumed that there are, just had Spotify as a listening app for music on their phone. I, for example, listened to Spotify, or just to music, often when I actually did something productive. At least I think it is productive. Whether it is in general productive for society is for someone else to judge, I guess. But now the question is, if we now take the music part, so the music part is here, and we now add the podcasting part, this already is a slight pollution of this beforehand very clean app. Of course, you can also listen to songs just for entertainment, but I think it is not so much a risk that you actually get sucked into it, because audio is something that is not as dominant in terms of our perception as video. So this means now, if Spotify is an audio app where there are people that are not usually displaying something like information, but just making music, maybe it's even just instrumental music, then on an addiction scale, how addictive is this? And of course, addictive is also a word that is used in a clinical context. But what I am now proposing is that we just use it in terms of how addicting is a app interface or just a service. So I want to use it in a more global context, you could say, in a more general, common context. So now, on an addiction scale, the Spotify before was maybe on a 1 to 3. I didn't really find myself clicking through tracks on Spotify. So now what Spotify already did is turn it more and more into something where you can discover new things, and the discovery of new things is often linked with getting rewards from our brain, which is then called dopamine, the release of dopamine. So the more you optimize a user interface for the release of dopamine, and therefore for the discovery of new things you haven't discovered before, the more you turn it into something that is addicting. So now if we move away from something that has basically no information that we can basically process, but only is basically sometimes drums, sometimes technical drums, sometimes electrical drums, sometimes with guitar, sometimes people singing. Of course, if people are singing, that can be also potentially addictive. But because it is just audio, it is just the stimulation of our ears, basically, of a sense that doesn't make up a large proportion of our perception, we still are kind of on the safe side. So now we enter the second stage. This second stage where we already have features like very colorful album covers, for example, that also change. They don't really change, but what actually is displayed on Spotify changes. This is maybe Spotify 1.5. Of course, I don't really know if there was ever a Spotify 1.0 that didn't have album covers, and also Spotify, the different ways to discover new content, like the different list Spotify actually makes for you, the different mixes. But now we enter the second stage, and the second stage is podcasts. So now what podcast is actually adding is again not visuals, so that's again still okay. So the only downside you could potentially have to this is that now Spotify constantly tries to push podcasts to you. And I don't want to listen to podcasts in Spotify. Why? Because I already have an app that is dedicated to podcasts. Of course now, again, from a business perspective, I do understand it. If you want people to listen to podcasts on Spotify, then you take the existing user base and then you just try to convert as much of the existing user base that is currently subscribed to Spotify for music and try to convert it also into podcast listeners. Because otherwise you just won't have the numbers after a few years. Or you just try to launch it completely new, but then people have to make new accounts which act as a hurdle and therefore makes it less likely that people actually will sign up with this new account, which could be potentially called Spotify Podcasts. They also try to make other services, like they had a service which was very similar to Clubhouse, which was a live audio chat app, a live podcasting show app, you could also say. It was, let's just look it up what it was called. Green Room. So now we are in the second stage, and we now have a more polluted Spotify. Because what is the basis of Spotify, at least in my perception still, is music. Of course, Spotify wants to change this perception in just trying to change what is Spotify to us by slowly nudging the users into using podcasts more and more. For example, by showing 6 podcasts, I think it's 6 podcasts, every single day to our face. Of course, sometimes there are also playlists. For example, I right now have 1, 2, 3. I have 3 podcasts in the 6 recommendations it just gives to me in the upper corner, or in the upper headliner, basically, not the headliner, but the head of my Spotify homepage. And I can change these. And there are also shows you might like. And there is a different podcast, another podcast, another podcast, another podcast, and another podcast. Why? I want to listen to music. But the thing I am greeted with and the thing I am seeing is I'm seeing one song I frequently listen to, one playlist I frequently listen to, another playlist, and the rest is podcast recommendations. Then we enter stage 3. Stage 3 now is video podcasts. So now these podcasts that already have pictures on them, that already have maybe thumbnails, specific thumbnails similar to YouTube. So basically it is already, at least in terms of the UI, until you click on something, of course, then you can only hear it. Before, so basically when podcasts were still audio on Spotify, you could only hear it. But you could already distribute thumbnails and also specific titles, episode-specific titles. Of course, every episode in podcast history probably had already episode-specific titles, but that's then exactly basically what the YouTube search engine also is. Of course, you cannot really use Spotify as a good search engine yet, because I guess YouTube is just much better in this. But if you now add video, then you not only have almost exactly the addictive interface of YouTube. Of course, you don't necessarily have the search functionality, but you have this home screen functionality. Of course, it's not identical, but it's going into this direction of YouTube. But what you also add is the thing that we are largely ingesting in terms of information, which is visuals. So you have audio and you have visuals. And therefore, this is also why video is so engaging. I think It's just the closest to reality. And because we like reality, and therefore we want to use all our senses in order to experience reality, the closer a piece of content is to reality, the more engaging it potentially is. At least in terms of the content format. So now, if we add video to Spotify, it basically turns it into a bad YouTube. And also, we have Spotify Music. But, of course, now the problem is that all of the users who don't want to have audio podcasts and who don't want to have video podcasts just are kind of left behind. And so, here are a few suggestions I would add. Even though they are only based on my... The main problem I have is that on the one side, I also distribute podcasts over Anchor to Spotify. Also, I'm trying to do video podcasts actually, like a video like this is probably ending up on Spotify. So basically, I want this distribution on the one side. But on the other side, on the consumer side, because I'm also a consumer, and this is again the role switching paradox, I realized that sometimes you just can play both roles and you can see both roles, and it doesn't really matter in which role you are, because if you are in this role, you have to act within the constraints of this role. Example, if you are at a party and you are the driver, then you might get comments about you not drinking alcohol. But if you then reverse the roles and you're not the driver, then you might find yourself in the exact same position, just reversed, and you might be the one that makes funny comments about the person who is driving not drinking alcohol. And I think the same is true now for here. If I would work for Spotify actually, I probably would think that it makes sense to introduce video to Spotify, because it just seems to be the most engaging format. And I want Spotify to be a profitable business, even for the not only for the people who will find Spotify in the process of adding audiobooks and also video, maybe in the future also series, so video series or basically TV series, but also in order to keep Spotify alive for all the existing customers Spotify already has. On the creator side, I can also understand it. I just wanna reach as many people as possible with something like this, even though there might not be many people that are interested in these kind of things. That doesn't really matter. I still have, at least to some extent it doesn't really matter, because I still have to record these and distribute these in the first hand. How many people are interested then will be something that I cannot really influence, at least linearly from the process or from the point in time from which I record something like this. And from a consumer perspective, I am more and more frustrated with Spotify. And I even went as far, I had to go as far as to block it during the day, during my work hours. Why? Because if there are shows on there, I usually watch on YouTube, and I now can watch on Spotify, and I usually have YouTube blocked and not installed on my phone, because I don't want my phone to be an addiction machine that just constantly more or less forces me indirectly, because of all the habits I already have established with my phone, and also because of the way the phone is designed and just the potential information you can access and the potential for addiction many of these apps have. I just don't want my phone to be something like this. And I also don't want to spend my life mindlessly consuming content on social media. But what I instead want to have is a tool. And Spotify used to be one of these tools. And this is already, I think, one of the conclusions we could draw from this. Spotify, at least for me, and I guess also for many others, was a tool. And now it turns away from a tool into something I have to actively spend time on and spend mental energy on to try to create a system that avoids this tool, because Spotify is slowly turning into another social media site.